we have a couple more stories for you guys this week, starting off with a big settlement out of the Air Force that is related to the Texas church shooting from a couple years ago, 2017. It's a horrible massacre. Jake, can you tell us a little bit more about exactly what happened there?
Yeah, so the big news of the week is the settlement came down for the families of the victims of that shooting. The Air Force is going to be forced to pay them $230 million because it was determined in a previous court decision that they were at 60%, which in these sorts of liability cases, you adjudicate who's most at fault for the liability settlement. And they were found to be 60% at fault because they did not share his domestic violence background with the FBI, which would have prohibited him from purchasing that rifle that he used. So big settlement.
Yeah, I mean, well, he was prohibited, right? He was prohibited under federal law, but the problem was that they didn't share his records from his time when he served in the military, like you said there. Right. And so he was able to go into a gun store that was a licensed dealer. He had a background check done on him, but he passed because they didn't share those records with the FBI. And so even though it was illegal for him to make the purchase, the gun dealer didn't know that because the background check system didn't work properly. And so that's what the core of this case was, right?
Correct. Yeah. So because under the Gun Control Act, he had a misdemeanor conviction of domestic violence from his time in service. He was court-martialed and was subject to a year of imprisonment, which, as we know, under federal law, prohibits you from owning, buying any kind of gun.
Yeah, he was prohibited in a couple different ways. He had a long history of criminal activity inside the military, but the military has its own criminal justice system, and so it's slightly different. Obviously, it doesn't. You're still prohibited. It's still illegal for you to own guns if you do any of the same sorts of crimes that would make you prohibited as a civilian while you're in the military. So, like, he was in the brig. He served time in military jail long enough to be prohibited, and also one of the incidents was domestic violence related, like you mentioned there, and so he was prohibited like 5 ways over. But they never shared the documents, and so he was able to buy his gun.
Yeah, and the DOD actually launched an investigation because obviously the Air Force caught a lot of flack for this when it was uncovered that he had a record. And the DOD uncovered that there were 6 separate occasions where there was an opportunity for the Air Force to share. They're required by law to share that information with the FBI. And for whatever reason, they blamed it on training, lack of adequate training. But 6 separate occasions where they could have shared that information and they failed to do so.
Yeah, and that was an ongoing problem with the military in terms of sharing these sorts of records with the FBI for a number of different reasons. Not even just background checks, but also for, when the military is tracking down criminals, people who committed crimes in the military and then fled, or any number of different things. They often weren't sharing important documents with civilian law enforcement like the FBI, and so it was a long-running problem. They actually passed legislation to deal with this as well in the aftermath of the Southern Springs shooting called Fix NICS, which just basically it added funding for increased compliance from the military branches with the statutory requirements you already outlined there. So that was kind of the fix for this was to try and get them to comply better because they had effectively just not done the things they were supposed to do. And eventually it led to a horrific mass shooting that took the lives of dozens of people down in Texas. This was also the incident where the bystander intervened and shot the attacker and caused him to flee. What was his name?
Stephen Williford.
Yeah, Stephen Williford. And so, this was a horrible incident that really could have been prevented if the Air Force had actually followed through on the records keeping requirements that they were supposed to. So I guess that's the core of why they're going to now have to pay the victims' families and some of the survivors as well this large sum of money. Although, in these cases, it's always a question of like, is that going to make any difference to the Air Force? going
Right.
forward. It's appropriate for the families to get compensated for their failure, for the failures of the Air Force, but you hope that it has some impact on the institution, but it's always kind of questionable as to whether or not it will. How much do government officials care about having to pay taxpayer dollars to a settlement like this? I don't know. So sad situation, but
Yeah, it's difficult to say because it's not only limited to just the Air Force. We've seen this in other scenarios as well. That the Dylan Roof shooting at that church in South Carolina, where it was local law enforcement that he admitted that he was a user of methamphetamine, which is also a prohibiting offense for purchasing a gun, but that was never shared with federal officials. So you sort of see this issue is a little bit endemic.
well, I think that situation was the FBI screwed up and they asked the wrong locality for information on his pending charges that he had. So yeah, there's often scripts like this. I think you wrote in the piece about Parkland as well. There was a settlement over a number of the screw ups by law enforcement there too, right?
Yeah, that's right. The FBI, because it came out that the FBI was warned several times. It was a credible threat that this individual was going to attack the school, and they just failed to properly investigate. So there was a $130 million settlement last November with the families of the Parkland survivors.
Yeah. So it's not uncommon for these sorts of things to happen where these red flags are ignored or records aren't shared and they lead to horrific consequences. Obviously, it's not like every mass shooting could be prevented this way, but certainly some of the most famous ones could have been prevented through just due diligence and people following the proper record sharing procedures. So it's really quite disturbing and sad that the shooting had to happen at all, given the details here.